Brazil and the United States have been deeply affected by the COVID pandemic. They lead the charts when it comes to deaths worldwide.
Combined, these countries exceed 1 million deaths, and this is affecting Brazilian and American economic, political, and social life. I'm Father Bob Dowd of the Department of Political Science at the University of Notre Dame.
And I'm Marcio Bahia from the Program of Portuguese and Brazilian Studies here at Notre Dame. Many analysts believe the pandemic was decisive in the United States election in 2020. Could it also be a determining factor in the 2022 presidential election in Brazil? And who are the two most likely candidates to face off for the presidency?
How are religious institutions, including the Catholic Church and neo-Pentecostal churches, positioning themselves in Brazil's political polarization? We'll address some of these pressing issues in this episode of Latin America Today. Marcio, let's start with some background.
Sure. In Brazil, we have been deeply polarized politically on the last decade. So today, that polarization is represented by two political figures. On the one side, we have the sitting president, Jair Bolsonaro, and on the other side, we have ex-president Luís Inácio Lula da Silva. Lula was our president from 2003 to 2010. He was a very popular president. Those were years of economic boom, reduction of poverty in Brazil, social inequality. So he was a very popular president when he left the presidency in 2010. He was so popular that he made his successor, President Dilma Rousseff, our first female president in Brazil. But unfortunately, she was not as successful politically and economically as Lula. And in addition to that, during her years, there were federal investigations that pointed to their party, the Workers' Party, also called PT, Partido dos Trabalhadores in Portuguese, involvement with multi-billion dollar corruption schemes. That political crisis led, one, to her impeachment in 2016, and in 2018, ex-President Lula went to prison. He was sent to jail. Very controversial. Some people thought it was a political move. Some people thought it was justice being served. So the fact is, he could not run for presidency in 2018, but now he's out of prison and he's eligible for 2022.
Marcio, this has all the sensationalism of a primetime movie. Jair Bolsonaro comes on the scene in 2018. He had been in Congress for several decades. He rides a wave of anti-Workers' Party sentiment due to the corruption. He campaigns essentially on a platform that is often described as sexist, as homophobic, as extreme right-wing. He somehow cobbles together a coalition of conservative voters, evangelical and Pentecostal voters, and wins election with 55% of the vote. Ever since then, of course, though, his popularity has plummeted, in large part due to the disastrous response to the COVID crisis and the economic fallout of all of that.
Yes, but he still has those core supporters that he'll guarantee that he'll go to a runoff election with ex-President Lula. We wanted to hear about what is in store for Brazil if these two polarizing figures run for president in 2022. So we asked Vitor Sandes, professor of political science at Universidade Federal do Piauí and a former guest scholar at Kellogg Institute here at Notre Dame. He's a specialist in elections, the party system, and coalitions in Brazil. He says Bolsonaro's response to the COVID pandemic has directly affected his popularity, as you said. Let's listen.
Então, assim que começou a pandemia e que o presidente Bolsonaro deu diversas declarações de caráter negacionista, né? Minimizando, por exemplo, a importância das medidas de restrição social, também chamadas de medidas de isolamento social, né, que evitam aí a contaminação, o espraiamento do vírus, ele também divulgou uma série de possíveis medicamentos que poderiam resolver, né, tratar a doença, chamou isso de tratamento precoce. Então, essas questões, elas soaram inicialmente muito mal em relação à opinião pública, principalmente para uma parte bastante esclarecida da população. E um outro ponto também importante foi que ele se articulou muito mal com os governadores. Então, o Brasil tem um arranjo federalista, então ele depende dessa articulação entre o governo central, o governo federal e os estados brasileiros, e os municípios. Então, nós temos o governo federal, 26 estados e o Distrito Federal, mais 5.500 municípios. Então, o nosso federalismo ele depende dessa articulação para que as políticas públicas, de fato, se realizem. Então, sobretudo no contexto de pandemia, que as medidas elas precisam ser muito efetivas e de uma maneira muito rápida. E isso não aconteceu. Então, os governos estaduais e o governo federal, eles caminharam em direção oposta. Isso, de fato, dificultou o combate mais eficiente da pandemia, o que, consequentemente, elevou muito o número de casos de mortes. Então, consequentemente, isso tem um impacto na popularidade.
And he believes there are insurmountable obstacles for Bolsonaro to win in 2022.
Então, diante de todos os problemas, né, relativos ao combate específico à pandemia, mas também aos seus efeitos, né, como a questão do emprego e a inflação, de fato, tem afetado fortemente a popularidade do presidente Bolsonaro. Então, esses são pontos centrais e é possível que essas questões não sejam atenuadas até as eleições do próximo ano. Muito difícil reverter esses problemas econômicos num prazo tão curto.
So, hearing that, Father Bob, let's talk about religion and how it's changed in the face of Brazil.
Right. Brazil is the world's largest Catholic country. But in recent decades, the evangelical and Pentecostal population has grown dramatically. Someone who studies this is our friend Amy Erica Smith. She is an associate professor of political science at Iowa State University and former visiting fellow at Notre Dame's Kellogg Institute for International Studies. She authored the book Religion and Brazilian Democracy, Mobilizing the People of God. We talked with her about the shifting religious and political landscape, and this is what she told us.
The 2020 census that has not yet happened would have shown that Protestants and Pentecostals constitute about a third of the Brazilian population today. And today, Catholics are a little over half of the Brazilian population, maybe around 55%, but the percentage Catholic is declining in Brazil and will likely fall below 50% this decade if demographers' predictions are correct.
So, did she say how these new religions might impact Brazilian politics?
We did talk about that. Listen.
Actual campaigning happens a lot more within evangelical and Pentecostal churches in Brazil. It has not historically been affiliated with any particular political party. Somebody's corner church has a pastor who has a good friend who is also an evangelical who says, and they say, okay, well, let's try to campaign within the church. And a church, if you think about it, a church is a really good place to run a political campaign. You've got a lot of more or less captive followers, and they care about what their clergy say. Politicians really believe that the endorsement of local pastors, local clergy helps their candidacy. What evangelicals and Pentecostals want when they're in politics. So, I mean, they're conservative on sexuality politics issues, issues of abortion and LGBTQ issues. But in terms of other issues, they're kind of more all over the place.
And she says Bolsonaro has capitalized on this growing group of evangelicals and Pentecostals. Here she is again.
Jair Bolsonaro's rise was not in any way driven by religion. He was an outsider candidate who was responding to tremendous political and economic crisis. Brazil had gone through years of political and economic crisis that led up to the 2018 election. In this context, a person comes in who says, I'm opposed to all of the old guard. He does really effectively at attracting, to some extent, conservative Catholics, but especially conservative evangelicals and Pentecostals. And he gets a lot of endorsements from conservative evangelical and Pentecostal clergy. What about his campaign, you might ask? One big part of it was that he was very strongly the anti-LGBTQ candidate. That was a really overt part of his campaign.
What was also really interesting is what she said about fake news and how that has affected Brazil's polarization.
There was also a fake news campaign that was largely run by his own team. So the shadow fake news campaign was all about tarring or portraying his opponent, his major opponent, the candidate from the PT, as being really extremely pro-LGBT. And one of the fake news memes, for instance, portrayed his opponent, Fernando Haddad, as intending to take people's children and forcibly transgender them. Like, we are going to assign a gender to your child. So these kinds of things really resonated in evangelical and Pentecostal churches and in evangelical and Pentecostal networks, because there's a real worry among evangelical and Pentecostal voters in Brazil that sexuality politics and liberalization on sexual issues has gone too far. So this led to really strong evangelical and Pentecostal support for Jair Bolsonaro in the 2018 election. Various studies have estimated that Bolsonaro would likely have lost the 2018 election very narrowly to Fernando Haddad if it hadn't been for evangelical and Pentecostal voters. This was really the group that put him over the top, and he got close to 70% of evangelical and Pentecostal voters in the second round election.
So with an increasing rejection of Bolsonaro's current administrations, polls show that the former president Lula is still very popular. What do you think about the challenges of the third term of Lula?
I also talked with Professor Sandes about that very question. He sees a difficult scenario with unemployment and poverty, recovery of the suffering Brazilian industry, and the very fragmented political landscape. Let's listen to him.
Certamente, a gente sairá desse momento com uma taxa de desemprego bastante elevada, mais elevada do que a gente já tinha antes da pandemia. Então, esse será um ponto-chave, né? Como criar políticas públicas para atender um público que não tem emprego formal. E além dos desempregados, ainda tem o que a gente chama de desalentados, são aqueles que nem buscam mais emprego, que também é bastante expressivo. Então, no Brasil, hoje, nós temos mais de 20 milhões de desempregados e desalentados, que é bastante expressivo, e, inclusive, de um público que seria economicamente ativo, né, poderia estimular a economia. Então, esse é um ponto importante. A gente tem um problema também da desindustrialização, que o Brasil tem sido afetado nas últimas décadas. Então, como criar políticas para incentivar a indústria local, para que o país não se torne dependente somente da exportação de produtos primários. Então, esse é um outro ponto, né? Claro que, por exemplo, a exportação de soja, por exemplo, que é tão importante para o país, claro que isso precisa, né, manter, mas é preciso também incentivar a indústria do país, né, que foi bastante impactada, sobretudo na pandemia. É preciso também criar e reforçar políticas sociais de tal forma a combater um problema que já tinha sido atenuado, que era o problema da pobreza, que voltou com tudo. Então, você precisa também ampliar programas sociais, não somente aqueles que visam garantir alguma renda, mas também todo o leque de políticas que dão dignidade ao indivíduo, né? Como políticas de saúde, políticas educacionais, políticas de habitação.
Brazil has bounced back from dictatorships and countless political and economical crises. For 2022, we have three possible scenarios: a third term of Lula, a second term of Bolsonaro, or a surprising presidency of a third candidate. Will any of those scenarios be able to reverse the current Brazilian crisis and bring prosperity and stability to the country? Will Brazilian democracy survive the assault of political polarization and fake news? Will the pandemic finally be under control in 2023? And will Brazil regain its position as a central world geopolitical power in Latin America and the world? Those are questions we will continue to explore here at Notre Dame.
This episode of Latin America Today was brought to you by the Kellogg Institute for International Studies at the University of Notre Dame, as well as Notre Dame International. If you're interested in watching the whole interviews, click on the links below. From everyone here at the University of Notre Dame, thanks for joining us, and see you in the next episode of Latin America Today.
See you soon.